The city of Chicago lay wrapped in winter's silver hush, the streets glistening with half-melted snow and the sighs of the weary. A late-night bus whispered through the empty avenues, its headlights cutting ribbons of gold through the fog. Inside, the world felt smaller, a moving cocoon of warmth and exhaustion, where stories that had unraveled long ago sometimes found their way back to the beginning. Naomi Carter sat near the rear window, her head resting lightly against the cold glass, her eyelids heavy with the weight of another 16-hour shift. Her scrubs were the color of midnight, worn thin at the edges, smelling faintly of antiseptic and lavender lotion. Every muscle in her body ached, but the ache wasn't just from work. It was from holding the world together with hands that never got to rest. Outside, snow drifted in slow, hypnotic spirals. Chicago after midnight was beautiful in the way loneliness can be beautiful. Still, cold, honest. The kind of beauty you can only see when you've been awake too long. Naomi's phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from Mrs. Ellis, her neighbor and lifeline. "Elijah's asleep. Homework done. I saved you some stew, honey. You did good today." Naomi smiled, tired but grateful. Her 9-year-old son, her heart, her reason, her miracle. He was safe, dreaming perhaps of planets and engines and the stars he promised to visit one day. And she was here, halfway across the city, fighting sleep so she could afford to keep his dreams alive. The bus rattled as it turned onto Damon Avenue. A few passengers remained, a college student snoring into his backpack, a woman humming softly to herself, and a man in a charcoal coat reading under the flickering light. Naomi barely noticed him. Her world had narrowed to the rhythmic hum of the tires and the memory of her son's laughter. She closed her eyes just for a moment. When you're that tired, bone-deep tired, your body stops asking for permission. Her head tilted, searching instinctively for warmth, for something to lean on. It found a shoulder, steady, solid, unexpectedly gentle. The man looked up from his book, startled, but said nothing. Outside, a gust of wind brushed against the bus windows like a sigh. For the first time that day, Naomi allowed herself to breathe. There was a kind of poetry in the way life could circle back on itself without warning. How one winter night, a woman who had forgotten what it felt like to be held could fall asleep on a stranger's shoulder, unaware that the stranger carried half of her past. But that revelation belonged to another hour. For now there was only the hush of tires against snow and the rhythm of two strangers breathing in unison. Naomi dreamed of sunlight, of the life she once imagined before bills and deadlines and endless shifts drowned her tomorrows. In her dream, she wasn't a nurse or a single mother or a woman haunted by what-ifs. She was simply Naomi, young, fearless, laughing under summer rain beside a man whose name she still couldn't say without her heart trembling. The bus slowed near Halsted and 18th, brakes sighing in protest. Naomi stirred but didn't wake. The man beside her, Ethan Moore, turned slightly, studying her face in the dim light. He didn't know why he cared, only that something about her felt painfully familiar. Her curls framed her cheek like ink on parchment. There was a quiet strength in the set of her jaw, a story written in small lines of fatigue and resilience. She looked like someone who had built her life out of ashes and kept smiling anyway. He wanted to wake her, but part of him couldn't. It felt wrong to disturb a peace so fragile, like touching the wing of a bird mid-flight. So he stayed still, listening, breathing, wondering why the universe had chosen this bus, this night. Outside, snow began again, gentle, relentless. Streetlights blurred into halos. The city pulsed with a kind of sacred loneliness, and within it, two souls sat inches apart, unaware that fate had quietly restarted their story. In the reflection of the window, Naomi's eyes fluttered open. The city lights rippled across her pupils like tiny galaxies. She sat up quickly, realizing where she was, embarrassed. "I'm so sorry," she murmured, her voice hoarse from sleep. "I didn't mean to." "It's okay," Ethan said softly. "You looked like you needed it." Naomi blinked, her thoughts still fogged with exhaustion. She nodded, gathered her bag, and stood as the bus hissed to its final stop. The man smiled faintly, polite, distant. And yet, something about his voice pulled at a thread she thought she'd long since buried. Outside, The wind was sharp enough to steal her breath. Naomi tightened her coat and started toward home, unaware that the man on the bus was watching her disappear into the snow, his hand frozen halfway in the air, as if he'd just seen a ghost. The camera would linger on that moment, the woman walking alone beneath a halo of falling snow, the man sitting in the dim light, and between them, the space where 10 years of silence waited to be broken. Because some stories don't begin with grand declarations. They begin with exhaustion and a bus, and the quiet mercy of someone letting you rest. If this story has found you tonight, maybe it's because you believe deep down that love can find its way back, even through the coldest storms. So if you're here, still listening, still believing, tap that heart, leave your thoughts below, and stay with us, because this is only the beginning. The doors hissed open, releasing a breath of heat to meet the bitter night. Naomi stepped down first, boots finding the slick edge of the curb, a flurry of snow fizzing into damp against her cheeks. She drew her coat tighter, as if she could button herself away from the gnawing pull of fatigue and the stranger's voice that still echoed like a chord struck long ago. He followed, careful, unhurried, one gloved hand on the rail, the other holding a slim, weathered paperback. Streetlights pooled in the crosswalk, painting the world in diluted gold. They stood there a moment, beneath the low scud of winter clouds, the bus shuddering behind them, as if deciding whether to lumber away or keep its own counsel. "I'm sorry," Naomi said again, softer now. "It's been a day." She didn't know why she offered that much, perhaps because the shoulder had been warm, perhaps because he hadn't flinched. "It looked like more than a day," the man replied, gentler than the wind. "I'm Ethan." He stopped on her name as if the act of asking were an intimacy. "And you're Naomi." The syllables felt like a decision. She almost laughed at herself. Names to strangers were harmless. Names to ghosts were something else entirely. They fell into step without agreeing to, shoes clicking in a fragile duet along the glazed sidewalk. A bar on the corner threw out music too bright for the hour. The scent of garlic and baking bread poured from a late-night bakery vent. And for an instant, Naomi's stomach reminded her she hadn't eaten since sunrise. She kept her hands in her pockets, nursing warmth the way one nurses a secret. "Are you getting far?" Ethan asked. He hadn't put the book away, but he'd stopped pretending to read it. Up close, his eyes were a pale, careful blue, the color of Lake Michigan on the morning after a storm. "A few blocks." She nodded toward a low row of brick apartment buildings that wore their fire escapes like black lace against the snow. A bus rumbled past. The wind flipped Naomi's curls across her brow. When she smoothed them back, his gaze caught, respectful, but with the startled patience of someone recognizing a painting they were sure had been put in storage. They reached the mouth of an alley where the street narrowed, and the snow turned to a fine, needling rain that softened the city's edges. A neon sign hissed above a shuttered barber shop. Naomi paused to adjust the strap of her bag. A worn composition notebook slipped out and thudded against her boot, splaying open on the concrete. A page bristling with hand-drawn diagrams greeted the night. Angles, arrows, a sketched fuselage of a plane. In the upper corner, E. Carter. Ethan bent to pick it up, then hesitated, palms empty, letting her decide. She crouched first, thumbs smudging a graphite line. When she straightened, she saw the question already forming in his eyes. "My son's," she said before he could ask. "He's 9. Builds things out of everything." "E," he repeated softly, and now the letter was suddenly heavy. He likes planes. He likes anything that moves and anything that turns light into motion." Her mouth tilted, unwillingly proud. "He says engines are just hearts with better boundaries." The rain gathered courage. It stitched the air between them tighter, pulled the sound of everything closer. A siren's distant thread. A train somewhere punching through steel and night. The patience of tires on wet asphalt. Ethan lifted his face to it the way a man does when he is deciding whether to speak the truth. "Naomi," he began, and she hated how her name fit so easily in his mouth. "I have the strangest feeling that—" She stopped him with a small open hand. "Please don't. Not tonight." The words gentled themselves. "It's late. I've got to go. I could walk you to your door." No insistence, just an offering, like a cup held out by the handle. She glanced at his book. The cover had softened with years in travel. Flight mechanics and control. How many lives ago had they shared a library table, whispering proofs into the velvet darkness, believing that brilliance could save them from everything that wasn't kind? "You always did read the manuals," she said. The corner of his mouth answered, a flicker of the boy he had been, bright, incandescent with potential. Then the flicker died, and a man stood in his place. The kind of man forged by long corridors and signatures in rooms where love was a liability. "I'm not sure I read the right ones." Lightning. There was none, yet something like it cracked through her chest. Anger wanted to bloom, but there was no soil for it tonight. Only the wet air and the throb in her calves, and the knowledge that a warm bed waited down a black-painted hallway, where a child with an engineer's soul dreamed under a quilt hand-stitched by a neighbor who refused to let them be alone. "I'm fine from here," Naomi said. She softened it with a thanks, then ruined the softness with a lie. "It was nice to meet you." Ethan's jaw worked once, a pulse of words he swallowed. He looked over her shoulder at the small grid of windows that held 1,000 lives, then back at the woman whose sleep had trusted his shoulder. "You drop this," he said, passing her the pencil that had fallen with the notebook and rolled to the edge of the curb. His fingers did not touch hers. The restraint was its own confession. She tucked the pencil away like a keepsake from an almost. The rain began to beat on his coat, darkening the wool to slate. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night, Naomi." She walked. He did not follow. The distance between them unfolded like a map she refused to read. Past the closed flower stand with its buckets turned upside down. Past the laundromat where machines blinked their insistent green. Past the bodega whose owner would look up and nod, already reaching for the same loaf of bread and small carton of milk. Naomi climbed the stairs to the stoop, found her key, and felt the door soften open beneath her hand. She did not look back. But once she was inside the narrow hallway, with its tin ceiling and the scent of old heating pipes, she pressed her back to the cool wall and let the night catch up. Her breath was a small white cloud in the dim. The shape of his voice had unlocked a room she had not entered in years, and she stood on its threshold, unwilling to cross, unable to close the door. On the street, Ethan remained beneath the barber's neon, as if a single step might shatter a fragile geometry he could not yet name. He slid the paper back into his pocket without noticing, fingers finding instead the corner of a photograph he kept tucked in his wallet. A sky filled with paper planes hurled from a dormitory roof, two students laughing like they were immune to gravity. Memory can be cruel in its accuracy. Tonight it was merciful only in that it did not speak. He could have called out. He did not. He could have run after her, made a promise that would taste like snow and regret on his tongue. He did not. He stood and listened to the city edit itself around a choice it had been waiting a decade to witness. Up the stairwell, Naomi rested a palm over the apartment door, feeling for the quiet hum on the other side. The baseboard heater clicking, the soft snore of Mrs. Ellis's old terrier, the steady, beloved rhythm of her son's sleep. She stepped in on silent feet, set her bag down, and laid the notebook on the table, open to the drawing of the little plane. In the upper corner, the letter E glowed faintly in the kitchen light, as if the graphite could hold a secret until morning. Outside, the rain thinned to lace. The bus rounded the corner and was gone. The barber's neon went dark. Two footprints faced each other in a small continent of wet sidewalk, already beginning to vanish. Some meetings ask nothing of us but politeness. Others press a thumb into the bruise of what we were, and wait. Naomi poured water into a glass, drank slowly, and held the cool rim to the place on her temple that remembered the shape of a shoulder. Then she turned out the light, found the hallway by touch, and let the darkness do what it does best. Keep what it's given, until morning decides what to return. Morning arrived thin and blue, the kind that makes a city feel like it's holding its breath. Naomi woke to the staccato tick of the baseboard heater and the soft rustle of paper, the composition notebook lying open on the kitchen table where she'd left it. Elijah had already slipped from his room, hair a tangle of curls, pajama cuffs riding high on narrow ankles. He hunched over the page with the concentration of a cartographer. "Mom," he murmured without looking up. If we alter the angle of attack by 2 degrees, the lift increases. See? He traced a pencil across the fuselage sketch, sunlight nicking the edge of the graphite like a blade. She kissed the crown of his head, breathing in the warm, salty scent of sleep. "I see," she said, and smiled because there are mornings when a smile is a decision that must be made before coffee. By the time she stepped outside, the snow had remembered how to be water. Puddles lacquered the sidewalks. Chicago shook from its shoulders the last glitter of night. Naomi kept her coat open and her pace even, a metronome against the drag of memory. County General would be calling her name by noon. Between then and now stretched a narrow space in which she could pretend that last night was a dream stitched by a bus window. At the corner, a man stood beneath a streetlight, collar up against the wet. The paperback was gone. His hands were empty. Naomi. Her name found her like a key in an old lock. She stopped because she'd always been better at honesty than avoidance. He took a single step forward and then, as if checking himself, stopped too. The space between them was a room they had both curated, air arranged around unspoken things. "I thought," he began, "that you'd say what should have been said," she finished, surprising herself with the softness in her voice. "It's been 10 years. He swallowed, the movement subtle. "I know." A delivery truck groaned past, spraying their shoes with a fan of cold water. Naomi didn't flinch. "You disappeared, Ethan." No warning, no why. I kept checking my phone like a ritual. I thought there had to be a reason I didn't understand yet. Then I thought the reason was me. "It was never you." "Of course it was me," she said, but the bite in the words had been eroded by time. Or maybe it was something heavier with my name fastened to it. Pick one. I stopped trying to decode a language that didn't want to be read. His eyes, those cautious lake eyes, held. I was young and I was persuaded. I let someone else write the ending to a story I hadn't finished reading. She didn't ask who. His silence wore a familiar silhouette, rooms with long tables and longer shadows, voices that turned love into arithmetic. He had always been brilliant at equations and terrible at subtraction when it involved people. Perhaps someone had done the subtracting for him. "Do you know what the worst part was?" Naomi asked, and when he didn't answer, she offered it anyway. Not anger, not even grief. It was the way the future went quiet, as if the world had been a symphony and then the conductor slipped away and left me standing with a violin I wasn't sure I knew how to play. "I deserve that," he said. "All of it. You don't deserve the life I built without you." She kept her chin level. "And you don't get to walk back into it and start rearranging the furniture." "I'm not here to rearrange anything." The corner of his mouth shifted. Not a smile, but the muscle memory of one. "I thought I was getting on a bus to get home. It turned out it brought me to where I left it." "Home is a word that costs," she said. "I can pay." "With what?" She tilted her head. "Money? Apologies? You can't buy back first steps and fevers and school forms. You can't refund nights when the baby cried at 2 and 3 and 4, and the only hand I could hold was my own." The gentleness in his face didn't falter. "No," he said, "I can't. I can only show up for the next ones." A guild wheeled low, ragged as a note torn from a page. Naomi looked past him to the slate smear of the river, to a bridge lifting its spine. She wanted to say that the door he imagined had rusted shut long ago and been painted over twice for good measure. She wanted the clean edges of refusal. Instead, her mouth formed a different truth. "I have a son," she said. He closed his eyes once, a slow shudder, as if the light were too bright. When he opened them, nothing in his body moved but his voice. "I know." "Do you?" She tasted iron behind the words. "Do you know about the nights he wakes to measure the distance between what he can imagine and what he can make? About how he asks why engines work and why people don't, and I tell him engines don't have a choice but people do. He sounds," Ethan's throat worked, "he sounds like you. He sounds like the best parts of what we were, pared down to an essence I don't know how to protect some days." Her breath feathered. "He is the only equation that solved me back to myself." "I would like to meet him," he said, not a plea, a sentence submitted gently for review. "You met part of him last night and didn't know it." She thought of the pencil exchanged like a truce. "I don't have space for chaos." "Neither do I," he said. I have only the space I make. The light changed. A couple splashed past, laughing as if they had discovered weather together. Naomi pressed her palms against the old iron of the railing to feel its cold. When I say I don't have space, I mean I won't let my life be a corridor you stroll down when you're sentimental. I don't take walks for sentiment, he said. Not anymore. You did once. I did many things once, he said, and the words were heavy with inventory. Silence moved in, tidy and exacting. Somewhere, a bell marked the hour. Naomi's pulse matched it for a beat, then steadied. You should go, she said softly. I will, he answered, but I'll be around. He let the assurance sit there, neither threatening nor timid. I won't touch anything that isn't offered. Her eyes flicked to his hands, open, empty, capable. Don't mistake endurance for invitation. I won't, he said. I'll learn the difference. A bus turned the corner, its windows glazed with ghosts. For a moment she saw them as they had been. Two students backlit by ambition, collapsing into laughter over a failed proof, his finger tapping a line of calculus on her wrist, as if ink could teach memory. A hallway kiss so careful it felt like a vow. Then the picture thinned and snowmelt reclaimed the morning. If you're waiting for forgiveness, she said, you'll be waiting a while. I brought a book, he replied, and the self-mockery in it loosened something at the edge of her mouth before she could stop it. She looked at the street, then back at the man who had once been a boy who could make gravity look negotiable. Be kind to yourself, Ethan, she said, surprising them both. You'll need it. Be kind to me in exactly the amount you can bear, he answered. I'll take no more. She nodded, because it was, unexpectedly, the right unit of measure. Then she stepped away, the heels of her boots finding their rhythm again. He did not follow. She felt, rather than saw him turn toward the river, as if the water might have answers. The day unspooled around them, sirens and coffee, and doors opening on hinges that had been oiled over years of use. At the end of the block, Naomi paused at the bodega. Mr. Singh lifted the loaf of bread and the small carton of milk without being asked, his forearms flour-dusted from the morning's chapati. Rough night? He asked. Long, she said. He handed her a clementine he'd kept aside for Elijah. She tucked it into her pocket and felt the small weight like a promise. Back in the apartment, the notebook lay where she had left it. She traced the initial in the corner, E, and let her finger rest there, not moving it, not yet ready to. In the distance, a train hooted once, a low, unlonely sound. On the Riverwalk, Ethan stood in a wind that tasted faintly of steel and thaw. He watched the surface flicker, wondering at the physics of reflection, how a face could be split and stitched by water into something truer than a mirror. He did not know how to atone for a decade. He knew only how to begin, with patience, with presence, with the quiet, unglamorous muscle of staying. Between them, the ghosts arranged themselves into a line of chairs, as they do for any audience worth the performance. They waited, polite but unyielding, for the living to speak more carefully than before. The afternoon unfurled like thin silk, translucent, easily torn. Naomi moved through it with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to make tenderness efficient. She cleaned the stovetop with slow circles, set rice to steam, peeled the clementine Mr. Singh had pressed into her palm. The bright peel released a perfume that rose through the little kitchen and settled in her chest like a remembered lullaby. Elijah sprawled on the living room rug, a topography of Legos and wire offcuts around him. He'd gutted a broken desk fan and had the motor singing again, low and stubborn, like a bee with a purpose. If I gear it right, he said, not looking up, we could power the little plane with a rubber band assist. Less battery drain, more fun. She teased. He grinned, and the room brightened in the way light does when it remembers itself. He confirmed, and slipped a rubber band over a spool with the delicacy of a surgeon. There were days when Naomi measured her life in fragments and found, to her surprise, a mosaic that held. A neighbor who left stew on the stove. A landlord who let her pay the last slice of the rent on the 15th. A nurse manager who knew when to send her home early because bone-tired is a kind of danger. The spine-straight certainty that she could calm a child seizing in triage, coax a breath back into a chest that had forgotten how, place a hand at a stranger's wrist and remind a pulse it was seen. And there were other days, quieter, lonelier, when she measured in what had been cut away. The scholarship letter, crisp as a promise, now tucked deep in a folder she never opened. A draft of a paper on biomaterials she'd once been proud of, annotated in Ethan's neat hand, the margin notes more love letter than critique. The apartment she'd planned in a city where the winters were gentler and the rents were not. The girl who said yes to the future out loud and believed the future was listening. She had not meant to love medicine and machines at the same time. One asked for mercy, the other for precision. Together they made a language she had thought she and Ethan would speak for the rest of their lives. They had shared library light at midnight, solved proofs on napkins, argued about the ethics of design, kissed in stairwells where the acoustics turned breath into music. Then the silence. Then the test with two lines like a horizon and a dare. Then the sudden fact of a life inside her. At the exact moment the life beside her vanished. She made lists. That is how she survived the first year. Lists and the holy piety of small tasks. Apply for benefits. Call the clinic. Learn to swaddle. Borrow a pump. Return the pump with cookies. Find cheap diapers. Learn to cut a clementine into perfect half-moons so a baby hand could hold sweetness without choke. Whisper the names of bones to a sleeping infant, because knowledge had to go somewhere, and lullabies can be Latin if sung softly enough. On the shelf above the sink sat a jar of broken watch parts, tiny gears and jeweled bearings rescued from a repair shop that had closed. Elijah called them constellations that fell. Sometimes after he slept, Naomi would pour them into her palm and feel the weight of patient engineering, the way time agreed to move because someone had made a mechanism for it. She would think of Ethan then, not with the serrated grief of the early years, but with the strange, almost neutral ache of a muscle that healed into a different shape. You can miss the idea of a person, she had learned, and still refuse to cut your present to fit their absence. She set plates, too. Mrs. Ellis would have eaten earlier, and cut the rice into loose clouds with a wooden spoon. Hands, she said, and Elijah patted in, obedient, solemn as a monk at a ritual. He scrubbed, shook, flicked water like rain off a dog. The small domestic arrangement steadied her in a way the big promises never had. Stability is made of repetitive acts you choose daily, she thought. Some romances are built the same way. When they ate, they did the math of the week together, quietly, like a card trick they both knew. Bus card topped up, field trip fee due Friday, Thursday night shift swapped because of a staffing hole, Saturday morning science club if the weather didn't ice the sidewalks. Elijah volunteered that the teacher had let him fix a stuck window today, and that the glass, when it finally dropped into place, made a sound like relief. He wanted to know if relief could be measured. By its echo, Naomi said, by what it lets in after. He looked at her as if she had handed him a new instrument. She had always tried to answer him with truth shaped like poetry. Reality is heavy, and children need handles. After dinner, he fused his contraption's wires with a soldering iron that had belonged to a janitor, who let him sweep after school in exchange for lessons. Naomi watched his small shoulders bloom with concentration and felt pride and terror flower in the same breath. She thought of last night's rain, the way Ethan's voice had gentled the edges off the word Naomi, as if it were a fragile object he had been told to carry without dropping. She had spent a decade glazing the crack his leaving made. Now light found it again. She folded laundry, a sock with a rocket ship, a shirt with a stain that would not confess its origin. The good towels, frayed into virtue. A dress she almost never wore, deep blue, cut to forgive and flatter, bought for the fantasy of a future celebration and then preserved like a relic. She held it up against herself and, without meaning to, saw a different body reflected in the window, one with softer edges and a gaze returned. She folded the dress away and tucked a whisper into its pleats. Not yet. On the counter, the envelope with the red stamp, Final Notice, sat under a magnet shaped like a pear. She slid it into the drawer with the takeout menus. The budget would bend. The budget had learned to bend without breaking. She turned off the living room lamp, and the apartment shifted into evening. Lamplight warming the kitchen, the hallway a ribbon of shadow, the bedroom door ajar like a promise kept loose. Before bed, Elijah brought her the plane drawing. Can we name it? he asked. He loved naming things, the power in it, the way a word could be both flag and home. What does it do? She asked. It turns a small force into a long patience. Then call it mercy, she said, and he nodded, as if he had expected nothing else. He slept quickly, as children do when the day has used everything it borrowed from them. Naomi sat at the table with her tea cooling, hands around the mug for the comfort of an orbit. She pulled the scholarship letter from its folder, read the salutation without taking in the words, and slid it back again. She took out a thin stack of photographs, 3, only 3. 2 students at a roof's edge, hands thrown out to the wind. A library table dense with notes and coffee rings. A mirror selfie in a lab coat, cheek to cheek. Their eyes bright with the kind of faith that can build a city. She put them away. She wiped the table. She checked the deadbolt. Then the secondary lock like a prayer said from muscle memory. She stood a long time in the doorway to Elijah's room, listening to the hush of sleep and the moth-pale flutter of the curtain in the heating draft. She thought, I made a world that does not require anyone who did not choose it. And yet, when she turned out the last light, the window gave her back a version of the street. Down there, beneath the barber's sign now dark, she pictured the place where 2 footprints had faced each other in the rain and begun to blur. She had told him she had no space for chaos. True, but she also knew this. Sometimes the heart is not a door to be opened or closed, but a window that fogs and clears by degrees. Naomi slid into bed and lay on her side, eyes on the stripe of city light that slipped between the blinds. Behind it, somewhere in the night-stitched blocks of Chicago, a man was learning how to be patient in a language he had been too young to speak a decade ago. She hoped he understood the grammar this time. She hoped he knew the rules he'd have to break and the vows he'd have to keep. The baseboard heater ticked. A snowplow sang its blunt, ecclesiastical hymn down the street. In the kitchen, the motor Elijah had revived spun itself into a quiet, contented hum, and Naomi, finally, slept. A steady, grateful sleep that left enough room for morning to bring what it would. The storm had a way of remembering. It lingered in the gutters long after the thunder moved on, whispering against windows as if it had unfinished business. Ethan stood under the narrow awning of an all-night cafe on North Clark Street, the rain sluicing past his shoes, pooling in the cracks of the sidewalk. The city smelled of steel and soaked asphalt, of coffee and regret. He had been here for hours, though he had nowhere in particular to go. Chicago after midnight was a city of windows, each glowing square a private constellation, and he, a man trying to map his way back by the light of his own mistakes. The rain didn't bother him. In some way, it suited him. It felt like penance made visible, a baptism without a God to forgive him. He remembered her saying she didn't have space for chaos, and he'd nodded, pretending that he understood. But now, standing alone in the drizzle, he realized that chaos was precisely what had driven every choice he'd made since the day he let her go. He tilted his head toward the sound of the L train rumbling overhead. The steel-on-steel shriek carried memories like shrapnel. Naomi laughing into his coat at midnight, the scent of her hair tangled with engine grease and rain, their voices overlapping while solving equations that blurred into confessions. You're going to build something that flies, she had told him once. Just promise me it won't be away from me. He had promised. He had broken it. Ethan's reflection in the cafe window was thin and drawn, but the eyes were the same. Those eyes that had once made her trust him, before they became the color of a lie told out of cowardice. A decade ago, when the letter from MIT's partner firm in Seattle came, he'd believed he could have both, the girl and the future. Then his father had arrived with his lawyer's precision and his mother's silence like a verdict. He'd sat across from them in their limestone mansion, the table long enough to seat a jury, and listened to his father speak of optics and expectations. Naomi's name was never said aloud, but it hung there, fragile as crystal. You've been accepted into something that can change your life, his father had said. Don't throw it away for a romance that won't survive the first winter. And he, afraid of losing everything, had folded. He'd told himself it was temporary, that he would build his success and come back for her, that she'd understand. But time is an unforgiving architect. It builds walls even when you swear you only meant to lay a foundation. He'd written to her once, twice. When the letters came back unopened, he'd believed she'd moved on. He didn't know that his mother had intervened, that every message, every call, every fragile attempt to reach across the silence had been intercepted, filed under, for his own good. It had taken him years to discover the truth. Now, in the muted glow of the cafe window, the memory of that discovery replayed itself. The day he'd opened an old box in his mother's attic, full of letters in Naomi's looping script. He'd read every one, the ink smudged by old tears he hadn't seen her shed. Letters that spoke of love and anger, of the small kicks of a baby inside her, of the fear of doing it all alone. He dropped the last one onto the floor and sank to his knees, unable to breathe. The realization had come not as a thunderclap, but as something quieter and crueler, a decade stolen by obedience. He could still see her handwriting in his mind now. Every curve and flourish burned into the back of his eyelids. "If you had just stayed," one letter had said, "we would have been fine. Maybe not rich, maybe not safe, but real. And that would have been enough." The rain deepened, and Ethan moved from the awning, letting it soak through the wool of his coat, through his hair, into his skin. He wanted to feel it, to erase the years of sterile boardrooms and marble floors and the dry, air-conditioned perfection of his mother's world. He had spent 10 years surrounded by glass towers, but had never once felt anything real. Tonight, the cold biting through his clothes was the first honest thing he'd known in years. He began to walk, his shoes slapping against the wet pavement, each step a sentence unfinished. He passed the bridge near North Avenue, where the river turned to silver under the streetlights. He remembered Naomi's laughter echoing here, their reflections side by side, the world still wide open before them. He stopped halfway across. The rain blurred the skyline into a watercolor of golden slate. He could almost imagine her beside him, the warmth of her shoulder, the sound of her voice teasing him out of his self-serious thoughts. "I'm still here," he whispered to the air, as if the river could carry the confession to her. But she wasn't here. She was somewhere across the city, maybe asleep, maybe awake, tending to the child he should have known, the boy who carried his eyes in her courage. Ethan leaned against the railing, his fingers slick with rain. Somewhere below, a tugboat horn groaned through the mist. It sounded tired, like him. He thought of his mother again, the way she'd looked at him when he'd confronted her about the letters. A flicker of panic, quickly masked by control. "You were not ready," she had said, her voice calm as ever. "She would have destroyed everything you've worked for." "No," he'd answered quietly. "You did." He hadn't returned to her house since. He'd resigned from the company bearing his family's name, the one he'd been trained since childhood to inherit. The headlines had called it Moore's Folly, but Ethan hadn't cared. He'd sold his shares, paid the debts his father had buried, and started something smaller, cleaner. A company built on engineering rather than image. A company that quietly funded community clinics, the kind of place Naomi worked in now. He hadn't done it for absolution. He'd done it because he needed something that mattered again. Now, watching the rain etch its silver script across the surface of the river, he understood that redemption was not a destination, but an act of endurance. To stay, to wait, to rebuild. He pulled the collar of his coat higher and began walking again, north toward the district where the streetlights dimmed and the houses leaned closer together. He didn't have an address, not yet, but he knew the direction. He always had. Behind him, the river swallowed the echo of his footsteps. Ahead, the rain thickened, and somewhere within it, though he couldn't yet name it, waited the faint, impossible warmth of beginning again. The community clinic on State and 24th wore its devotion in chipped paint and hand-lettered signs. Inside, warmth was something the people made, radiated from tired bodies and kind eyes, from posters of food pantries and prenatal classes, from the jar of crayons set permanently beside the blood pressure cuff. The air held that peculiar blend of antiseptic and hope. Naomi pushed through the door with her badge between her fingers, the night shift still ghosting her shoulders. The waiting room hummed with the modest music of survival. A mother bouncing a baby in a winter hat shaped like a fox. An older man rehearsing his list of symptoms under his breath. a teenager pretending not to be afraid. Behind the desk, Anna waved with a pen between her teeth. "Morning, Nurse Carter," Anna said, ink blooming on a sticky note like a sudden flower. "You're early. Coffee's a miracle today. Dr. Greer found a donut." Naomi arched a brow. Dr. Greer, the clinic director, was a woman whose miracles were never accidental. "A donor for coffee?" "For everything." Anna leaned closer, conspiratorial. "Grant came in at dawn. Anonymous. Big." Naomi stilled. "How big?" "New ultrasound machine big. New roof big. Keep the lights on for a year big." For a long second, the receptionist area brightened, as if someone had opened a door to morning itself. Naomi pictured the electromagnetic hum of a machine that worked reliably. The parents who would see their child's heartbeat on a clean screen instead of a fuzz cloud that required her to apologize for the century. She nodded once, because joy too could be a decision. "Greer wants a quick huddle," Anna continued. "Donor reps coming by to tour." The staff gathered in the hallway at the heart of the clinic, beneath a bulletin board crowded with paper stars, the names of patients who'd quit smoking, graduated from programs, found housing. Dr. Greer stood with her hands in her pockets, grinning in a way that made her look younger and more dangerous. "Friends," she said, "someone believes in us. The Moore Foundation has awarded us a multi-year grant. They've asked to send a representative to see how we operate." The name pulled a thin thread through Naomi's chest, taut as violin wire. Moore. The syllable rung like a fork tapped against a glass, calling a room to attention. She kept her face neutral and let the thought drift past. Moore was a common name. Chicago was full of them. The huddle broke into handshakes and small, stunned laughter. Naomi returned to the exam rooms, rolled up her sleeves and went to work. The morning blazed by in fragments, a blood sugar check, a belly measure, a worried father learning to swaddle with the fierce concentration of a man defusing a bomb. Naomi's hands did what they'd been taught, steadied, warmed, mended. The clinic breathed around her in a rhythm she trusted. Near 11, Anna tapped at the door jamb. "They're here," she said softly, the way people say company about someone who might be family. Naomi followed her to the lobby and saw the suit first. Well cut, rain dark at the hem, humbly expensive. The man inside it stood with an attention that reminded Naomi of pilots waiting for clearance. Still, alert, braced for responsibility. It was Ethan, of course. It was always going to be. For a heartbeat, the room held two histories, the one in which she'd never seen him again, and the one they were breathing now. He took in the posters, the hand sanitizer pump tied with red twine because the original bracket had snapped, the corner where the toy bin had become a tiny republic. When his gaze found Naomi, it stopped like a tide against a wall. "Mr. Moore," Dr. Greer said, crisp and pleased, unaware of the drama that had just hung itself from the ceiling. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you for having me," Ethan said, eyes never leaving Naomi's face. "I'm here to observe and to listen." Moore Foundation. Naomi could taste metal now, like a coin on the tongue. The syllables were no longer cautious. They were intimate. She gathered her breath into her spine and let it keep her upright. "Naomi," Dr. Greer said, turning, "will you show Mr. Moore our prenatal room?" "Of course," she heard herself answer. They walked down the slender hallway, past the bulletin board of stars. Ethan smiled at the names as if each were a secret he'd been permitted to keep. Naomi opened the exam room door and stepped aside to let him enter first. The small space looked suddenly staged, like the set of a play. Clean sheets, a blood pressure cuff, a wall chart of fetal development nearly a decade old. She closed the door softly behind them. His voice, when it came, was gentle. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." She laughed once, softly, with no humor. "Like what? A miracle dressed in hand-me-downs?" "Like me being the reason this room has new paint," he said, and only then did she see the faintest smear of it along the baseboard. Fresh, careful, not yet cured to indifference. "And not the reason you sleep." Naomi considered the instrument tray, shining with low, dutiful light. "Tell me something true, Ethan. My mother kept your letters from me." No hesitation. "She answered you once under my name when I wouldn't, to make it clean. I found everything 2 years ago in a box labeled archival. I've been wrong about many things, but not about this. I left, and then I stayed gone. That is mine to own, not hers, not circumstance. And the money? She made the word ordinary. She would not let it be a poison. What does it buy? Time, he said, with less breaking in it. She wanted to hate the answer and could not. She wanted to thank him and would not. Instead, she reached up and straightened a poster's curling corner. Why here? Because I know what it means to watch a system work with parts that don't fit, he said quietly. Because I know you're the kind of person who keeps showing up when the maintenance light has been blinking for years. He took a breath. Because this is where the next right thing lives, and I need to be near it. He was not pleading. He was confessing to a priest he hadn't earned. Naomi sank onto the little stool beside the monitor. You can't fix us, she said. Not with grants. Not with apologies. I won't try to fix you, he said. I will try to be of use. She looked at him then, not at the coat or the eyes or the catalog of regrets he wore like a second shirt, but at his hands. They were engineer's hands still, nicked, careful, more honest than the rest of him. What else did the box hold? She asked, surprising herself. A photograph, he said. Roof of the dorm, paper planes, you and me, facing the same wind. Her throat tightened. Memory arrived like the first warm day of spring. Excessive, a little embarrassing. I never wanted an empire, she said. Just the work. Just the person beside me to be the same person at the end. He nodded once, the gentlest assent. So did I, he said. I just learned it too late. A knock skittered against the door. Dr. Greer poked her head in. Naomi, Mrs. Parker's here early for her ultrasound. Says the baby's practicing karate. Can we? We can, Naomi said, springing lightly to her feet as if her body had been waiting to be useful. She gestured to the aging machine. Let's give her the good screen, she added, then paused, considering the man in the doorway. Do you know how to move boxes, Mr. Moore? He blinked, then smiled. Professionally. Good, she said. The new unit is still in packaging. Anna will show you where. I don't authorize miracles I can't plug in. They wheeled the crate down the hall together, Naomi at the front, Ethan at the back, a choreography as old as work. In the waiting room, Mrs. Parker sat with her hands folded over her belly, joy already making a place for itself beside fear. Anna clapped softly when she saw the machine, as if they'd pushed in a cake with candles. In the room, Naomi unboxed the probe with a reverence she usually reserved for newborn crowns, and the first shaky breaths of asthma calmed. She entered Mrs. Parker's name, the date, the hurried, necessary prayers embedded in every keystroke. When the screen bloomed into gray-white galaxies, the room stilled. There it was, the arch and dive of a spine, the burst of a foot, the ecstatic drum of a heart. Ethan took a step back to give the family more air. While Mrs. Parker laughed and cried in the same breath, Naomi glanced up at him. His face was open, not empty, open, a window someone had finally thought to unlatch. When the appointment ended, he carried the empty packaging to the recycling, like a parishioner clearing the altar. Naomi walked him to the lobby. They stood again under the bulletin board of stars. Thank you, she said. The words tasted odd, not because they were untrue, but because they belonged to a language she'd sworn she would speak carefully. I'm glad to be the least important part of something that matters, he replied. She held his gaze. You don't get to haunt my hallways, she said, quiet but plain. You can help. You can wait. You can leave the door alone until it opens. He nodded, as if she'd handed him a manual at last. I'll read this one, he said, slowly. She almost smiled. Almost. Slow is the only speed I respect, she said. Then she was gone, back into the pulse of the clinic, the door swinging closed behind her with a softness that promised nothing and withheld nothing. In the lobby, Ethan looked up at the stars again, the names written in marker, the tape curling at the edges, and understood, with the stunned humility of a man who had stayed in the rain until morning, that some constellations are made by hand, and that the only way to navigate by them is to keep your head up and your pace small, and to learn the sky as it is, not as your maps insisted it should have been. The gymnasium smelled of waxed floors and anticipation. Balloons bobbed against the ceiling. Construction paper stars trembled on strings of fishing line. Folding tables lined the walls, each one crowned with a cardboard trifold display splashed in glue, graphs, and the strange alchemy of childhood invention. The annual South Loop Elementary Science Fair was the kind of chaos that made teachers age and parents beam. Ethan stood just inside the doorway, visitor badge skewed on his lapel, trying not to look like the only adult there without a child. A teacher had introduced him earlier as one of the guest judges, an engineer and sponsor from the Moore Foundation, come to support young innovators. The irony wasn't lost on him. If anyone here deserved to judge curiosity, it was her, the woman he'd once built dreams beside, not the man who had abandoned them. He'd almost said no when the invitation arrived, but something in the timing, a week after his visit to the clinic, a night filled with insomnia and the echo of Naomi's voice, had pressed him forward. Redemption didn't announce itself, he decided. It arrived disguised as work. The air was alive with questions. Does solar paint really work? How far can worms smell? What happens when you charge a potato? Laughter bent and swelled like a current. Ethan felt out of place among the sticky fingers and poster boards, and yet something loosened in him here. The way he used to feel on university campuses, where every door seemed to open to possibility. He was halfway down the aisle of exhibits when he stopped. The display in front of him wasn't bright or messy like the others. It was deliberate, almost architectural. At its center stood a small model, an aircraft, fashioned from thin balsa and recycled aluminum. Its wings curved upward like a smile. Across the board's header, written in tidy, confident letters, Project Mercy, Kinetic Propulsion Through Elastic Potential. Below, a line of smaller text, Elijah Carter, Grade 4. The name struck him first like déjà vu, then like a hand around his ribs. He bent closer. The boy who stood behind the table, skin a warm copper shade of late autumn, hair a wild halo, was explaining the mechanics to a pair of teachers. His voice was clear, decisive. So the rubber band stores energy when wound, right? The trick is how to release it efficiently. I adjusted the propeller's axis to change how the force spreads. He mimed the movement, small hands quick and sure. Ethan recognized the gesture, the same one he used when describing airflow models in graduate school. The same habit Naomi had teased him for. You talk with your hands like you're sculpting the air. The teachers applauded softly and moved along. Ethan lingered. The boy caught his gaze and offered a polite, curious smile, the kind given to strangers who seem friendly but not familiar. Hey, Elijah said. Do you want to try it? Ethan cleared his throat. I'd love to. The boy wound the propeller, the rubber band singing in miniature protest. Ready? Ethan nodded. The tiny plane shot forward across the floor, smooth and straight before gliding to a gentle stop against a chair leg. That's impressive, he said. The balance is perfect. Elijah beamed, dimples cutting into his cheeks. Thanks. My mom helped me test the wing curve. She said life's about balance too. Your mom sounds like she's right. Ethan managed, his voice almost steady. She's a nurse, the boy said proudly. She works a lot, but she says that's okay because she's fixing people. Ethan smiled, because he couldn't do anything else, because the alternative was breaking in front of a 9-year-old. Fixing people, he repeated softly. That's important work. The boy nodded. Yeah, she says machines are easier though. They listen. He laughed, and it felt like a forgotten instrument clearing dust from its strings. She's not wrong. Elijah tilted his head, studying him with sudden seriousness. You sound like you know about machines. I do, Ethan said. A little. I used to build things that flew. Planes, among other things. Cool. Elijah's eyes widened. Did they work? Not always, he smiled. But when they did, it felt like the world was giving you a second chance. The boy nodded gravely, as though filing that away. Naomi's voice arrived before he saw her. Warm, calm, threaded with exhaustion. Elijah, did you eat something yet? Ethan turned. She was moving between tables, a paper cup of lemonade in one hand, her clinic ID still clipped to her coat. She hadn't noticed him yet. Her attention was on her son. She brushed a curl from his forehead, adjusted his collar, and laughed when he pointed proudly at the model. Mom! The judge liked it, Elijah said. He used to build planes too. Ethan felt the world narrow. Naomi looked up. The cup trembled in her hand, a small ripple of yellow. For a breath, no one moved. The fluorescent lights hummed. A banner overhead swayed gently, proclaiming curiosity builds the future. And for a heartbeat, Ethan believed it might. "Mr. Moore," she said at last, her voice even, professional. "I didn't realize our benefactors also judge science fairs." "Sometimes the assignments overlap," he replied softly. "I didn't realize your son was an engineer." Her lips pressed together, something sharp flickering behind her composure. "He's curious," she said. "That's all." Elijah looked between them, puzzled by the undercurrent he couldn't name. "Mom, Mr. Moore says when things fly, it feels like the world forgives you." Naomi inhaled, slow and deliberate. "That's a nice thought," she said, eyes fixed on Ethan. "But some things don't need forgiveness. They just need distance." He swallowed. "I didn't come here to—" "I know," she interrupted. "You came here for the children, for the community, for redemption with clean paperwork." Elijah blinked, confusion blooming. "Mom?" Naomi crouched beside him, the motion breaking her poise into tenderness. "It's okay, baby. Go see the other projects. I'll catch up." When the boy ran off, Ethan found it difficult to breathe. "Naomi." She straightened. "You don't get to say my name like that. Not here. Not when he's standing 20 feet away." He nodded, shame thick in his throat. "I didn't know," he said, "about him, about you. I swear I didn't." "I believe you," she said quietly. "But believing doesn't change the years." Her eyes were wet but steady. "Do you know what he told me last night? He said he wanted to build something that could fly and come back." She looked at the little plane on the table between them. "I told him that was the hard part." The sound of applause rippled from the stage as the principal began to announce awards. Ethan stood there, the crowd's cheer fading to a distant hum. Naomi turned away, her son's name bright and strong as it echoed across the microphone. "Elijah Carter, winner in aerodynamics." The boy bounded toward the stage, sunlight of every kind rushing to meet him. Naomi clapped, her face an even light. Ethan, unseen in the crowd, felt something unclench in his chest, an ache that was both grief and awe. For the first time in years, he felt pride that didn't belong to himself, pride for the boy he'd never known, and for the woman who'd taught him how to fly, and then, when he failed, taught herself how to stay. The gymnasium emptied the way tides do, slowly, then all at once. Paper stars spun lazily in the warm air as parents folded chairs with the reverence of people closing a ceremony. Naomi signed the last permission slip at the edge of a table, her pen catching on a patch of dried glue. When she looked up, she found Elijah and Ethan kneeling on the varnished floor, shoulder to shoulder, rebalancing the little plane as if they'd been doing it for years. "See?" Ethan murmured, turning the prop shaft a whisper to the left. "It wants to drift because it's eager. Curiosity pulls." Elijah laughed. "So I should make patience part of the design." Exactly. She should have interrupted them. She didn't. There was a gentleness moving between the two, unplanned, unpracticed, true, that made a still place inside her chest. Elijah asked question after question, not to impress, but to understand. Ethan answered with a care that felt like apology shaped into instruction. Outside, the late afternoon wore its February light, cold and honeyed. The wind had calmed, puddles mirrored a pale sky. Naomi walked beside them to the front steps, the blue ribbon tucked into Elijah's pocket like a secret talisman. He bounced on his heels, kinetic with triumph. "Mom, can we test Mercy at the park?" he asked, already halfway down the steps. "In 20 minutes, she said. "Homework first." He groaned, then grinned. "Worth a try." A teacher called him from the curb to take a photo with the winners. He sprinted away, ribbon flashing. The space he left took the air with it. "You'll need to tell him," Ethan said quietly. She kept her gaze on the cluster of children, arranging themselves into a pyramid of uneven heights. "Tell him what?" He didn't pretend. "The truth." Naomi let the words sit between them like a glass set carefully on a table. "I decide the timing," she said. "I carry the cost." "I know," he answered. "I won't take that from you." The photographer made them switch rows twice. Elijah never stopped smiling, though he kept glancing toward Naomi like a compass checking north. When the picture was finally taken, the little crowd unfurled. Elijah barreled back, breath steaming. "Can Mr. Moore come to the park?" he asked. "He knows how to make patients fly." Naomi felt something old in her unclench. "For a few minutes," she said. They walked to the small rectangle of grass behind the library where trees flanked the benches like kindly guards. Elijah wound the propeller with ceremony and released Mercy into the air. The plane made a true, steady arc and settled, as if deciding on that patch of earth after a long negotiation. "Again," Elijah said, and again became a loop of joy. Between flights, he and Ethan altered small things: angle, tension, hope, testing the world's permissions. Naomi warmed her hands around a paper cup from the cafe's back window. The coffee had gone tepid, but she held it anyway, for the comfort of holding something. When the light began to retreat, they walked back together, the plane tucked into Elijah's backpack like a bird at rest. At the corner, a bus sighed to a stop and exhaled its passengers. The three stood in the seam where goodbye becomes ritual. "I have to go finish my math," Elijah announced, with the weary pride of a person who belonged to numbers and knew it. He looked up at Ethan. "Thanks for helping me calibrate patience." "Any time," Ethan said, and Naomi heard the vowel behind the word. Elijah took off down the block to race the imaginary competitor he invented whenever sidewalks begged for sprinting feet. Naomi watched him reach the building, and as always looked back to make sure she was watching too. She raised a hand. He waved so hard his whole body waved with it, then vanished inside. Only then did she say, "Walk with me." They didn't speak for a while. The city's evening had begun to braid itself, dogs tugging their people towards supper, a saxophone from an upstairs window practicing scales brave as declarations. They passed the bodega. Mr. Singh lifted a hand, reading the map of their faces and deciding kindly not to ask. On the stoop, Naomi sat 2 steps above him, as if the architecture could grant her the altitude she needed to say it. "I used to think if I held this truth alone, I could shape it into something safe," she said. "That keeping it in my mouth kept it from the wind." Ethan listened with his whole posture, an attentiveness that asked nothing extra of her. "I learned you'd left the week the test turned positive," she continued. "I tried your number," I wrote. "I waited longer than pride should allow. Then I folded the waiting into work." She paused. "He came into the world angry about the light and ready to eat it anyway. He has your stubbornness. He has your eyes." His hands on his knees tightened once, then stilled. "I should have known him," he whispered. "Yes," she didn't soften it, "but you didn't. And now you do. That's the fact we have." He nodded, the motion slow, like someone agreeing to a difficult regimen. "What do you want from me? Not someday, now." She felt the gravity of the question settle in her bones. Want was a dangerous verb. It could trick you into mistaking longing for logistics. "To be a presence that does what it says," she answered. "To stand where you say you'll stand and to leave when I say leave. To love him in a way that doesn't ask him to hold your guilt." "He won't," Ethan said. "I'll hold it. I'll build with it." "And me?" she asked, surprising herself with the smallness of her voice. He looked up, the streetlight catching in his eyes like lake water catching the moon. "I'll love you in the tense you can bear." She almost said, "Don't." Instead, she looked at the window where a curtain shifted and knew Elijah was tracking the silhouette geometry of their conversation. "He'll have questions," she said. "I'll answer them. But I won't hurry him into a name." "I'll be whatever he calls me," Ethan said, "until he decides again." A car door thunked somewhere down the block. A child laughed. A dog decided, decisively, to love a lamppost. The ordinary evening insisted on being ordinary, and the sanctity of that steadied her. "Tomorrow," Naomi said, "come by after school. Tools, not presents. We're fixing a broken cabinet hinge that keeps pinching fingers." "I'll bring a hinge," he said. "And patience. And dinner," she added, not as a test but as permission. "There's a way to feed us that doesn't try to pay for anything." He smiled then, a small, grateful thing. "I know a place that respects rice." "Good." They stood. At the door she stopped, her hand on the cool brass. "One more thing," she said without turning. "Don't make promises to impress my courage. Make them because you finally know the shape of your own." "I do," he said. I'm learning it from a fourth grader and a woman who didn't leave. She went inside, the latch catching with that familiar, forgiving click. In the hallway, heat pipes ticked like a metronome finding tempo. Elijah was at the table, pencil poised, eyes bright with questions he hadn't yet chosen. She kissed the top of his head and sat beside him, aligning herself with his sums. Outside, Ethan descended the stoop slowly, as if stairs were a new technology and he intended to honor the design. He walked the block with his hands in his coat pockets, not to hide them, but to keep from reaching for something that was finally reaching back. When he passed the library lawn, he paused and looked at the narrow strip of grass where a small plane had decided to land, honest and unshowy as a truth told late but told well. He tipped his face to the sky, a dull pewter with one brave star, and felt not forgiven, but allowed. It was enough. It was, for the first time in 10 years, a place to begin. Ethan arrived at dusk with a paper sack that smelled like ginger and sesame, a small box of hinges, and a toolkit he'd had since college, the handles polished by years of problem-solving he'd thought were more important than the ones under this roof. Naomi had left the door on the latch. He knocked anyway. She opened to him with sleeves rolled, the kitchen lit in amber. Elijah at the table raised a hand without looking up from his math sheet, counting quietly as if numbers required reverence. "Dinner first," Naomi said. "Then we make cabinets repent." They ate standing, laughing at nothing in particular, how the rice refused to obey the spoon, how the soup scalded and soothed in the same breath. Elijah narrated his day with the proprietary pride of a boy who had won a ribbon and discovered Velocity's manners. When he finished, he wiped the table with a precise hand, the way Naomi did, then fetched the screwdriver like a knight summoned for a quiet crusade. The cabinet hinge had been closing its own verdict on unsuspecting fingers. Ethan crouched, set the toolbox open like a small altar, and taught the liturgy of repair. Lefty-loosey, righty-tighty, but listen for the wood, it will tell you when to stop. Elijah leaned in, breath held. Naomi stood back, arms folded, the line of her mouth soft. They moved as a small orchestra, Ethan loosening the work plate, Elijah holding the door with both palms and his whole heart, Naomi passing the new hinge like a surgeon's instrument. It wasn't glamorous, the victory when the door swung true. It was better. The kitchen exhaled, as if relieved to be trusted again. "Patience installed," Elijah declared. Ethan held the door and let his voice be light. "The world forgives good engineering." Naomi's eyes flicked to his. "Sometimes," she said, "sometimes it needs more than screws." Elijah packed the tools, humming, then vanished to his room to build a runway from textbooks and twine. The apartment took on the quiet that follows good work. Naomi rinsed bowls. Ethan dried them, careful with the thin porcelain, as if it could remember every hand that had held it. "Tomorrow," Naomi said, not looking up, "I'll call a clinic downtown. We can schedule a test." She did not say DNA. She did not need to. He nodded. "I've spoken with an attorney," he said carefully. "I can be listed without pushing. We'll do it your way." "My way," she repeated, but the bite in it had cooled to a fact. And then his. They set the bowls aside. Elijah's voice rose faintly in the next room, coaching air into flight. Ethan wanted to look at him. He didn't. Reckoning, he understood, was not an act performed in front of an audience. It was the work you did with your eyes down, your hands honest. Naomi wiped her hands on a dish towel and leaned against the counter. "He asked today, on the walk home, if all inventions know where they came from." "What did you say?" "That it's the making that matters," she said. "And sometimes the maker learns that late." The towel twisted between her fingers, then lay still. "Elijah's not an invention. He's a person. He doesn't need a myth. He needs a man." "I know," he let the admission anchor him. "I'm trying to be one." She studied him as if assessing a structure for load. "Then you should go and close the doors that have been swinging for a decade," she said. "You know which ones." He did. The house on Astor Street faced the lake like a ship determined to ignore weather. Inside, everything was curated to a hush. Persian wool, glass, the gloved silence of money. His mother, Vivian, descended the staircase with her practiced grace, pearl studs steady as stars. His father, Walter, stepped from the study. the leather chair still rotating a fraction behind him, as if his absence had barely disturbed it. "Ethan." His mother's relief fractured into a smile. "You look thin." "I'm busy," he said, and finished. He placed the family key on the hall table. It made a sound that, in other rooms, might have been called music. Walter's gaze sharpened. "If this is about the company, it isn't." Ethan turned to his mother. "It's about Naomi Carter." And Elijah. She didn't startle. She was too well trained for that. Her hands closed once, at the knuckles, the smallest failure of choreography. "You found the letters." "I found my life," he said evenly, "in a box labeled archival." "It was for your own good. It was for your comfort," he corrected, calm. "You called my fear prudence, and my love immaturity. You organized my future the way you organized this house. No dust, no noise, no strangers. You made us strangers, Mother. To our child. To each other." Walter's mouth thinned. "That woman would have ruined you." "She made me," Ethan said quietly. "Or rather, she helped me remember what I wanted to be. You ruined the rest." His father laughed once, without warmth. "You'll regret romanticizing poverty. We saved you from it." "Poverty wasn't what frightened you," Ethan said. "It was proximity. To people who need things you can't invoice. To love that won't wear your crest." Vivian stepped closer, voice lowered like a confession. "We wanted you to be safe." "I wanted that too," he said. "I confused safety with absence. They're not the same." Walter poured 2 fingers of scotch and didn't offer it. "What do you want, Ethan?" "Not your money," he said. "Not your name. Not your permission." He slid a folder across the console. Letters of relinquishment. The last ties clipped. "And your distance. You will not approach Naomi. You will not approach Elijah. If you need to atone, name a scholarship anonymously and disappear into the good it does." Vivian's eyes glistened but did not spill. "He is our grandson. He is a boy," Ethan said steady, "not an heirloom to display. If one day he wants to know you, I will not stop him. But you will not find him the way you find lost silver. You will not shape him with your hunger and call it legacy." Walter's silence turned flinty. The house seemed to lean away from them, as if architecture could choose sides. Ethan waited. The pause broke into a nod so small it might have been a muscle tick. It was enough. He left the key where he had placed it. On the sidewalk, the wind from the lake carried a clean, metallic cold. He hadn't realized how stale the house air was until this breath. He worked late that night at the small warehouse his startup rented in Pilsen. An old factory skin repurposed for something that made more sense to his hands. Between prototypes and open code, he wrote 2 emails. One to his attorney, authorizing the paternity filing Naomi would initiate. One to a banker he trusted, establishing a fund in Elijah's name he could not touch alone. There would be no gifts that behaved like chains. Naomi would have co-stewardship. Elijah would have say when he was ready. This was what repair looked like in his language. Signatures that constrained him. Frameworks that protected them. He printed a letter, old-fashioned, on paper that would last. Not for Naomi, for the boy. He didn't know when it would be right to give it. He knew only that some truths should be written before they were spoken. He dated it and folded it carefully, his name small in the corner like a bead sewn at the hem. The city slept. Machines differed. He turned off the lights and stood by the door in the dark, listening to the space remember its night sounds. Reckoning, he thought, was not the hammer you brought down on your past. It was the hand you learned to raise only when you'd measured what might break. In the morning, he returned with bagels and a hinge for the bathroom door, which stuck in humid months and taught bad language. Naomi let him in. Elijah padded out in socks, hair riotous, the blue ribbon now clipped to the curtain with a clothespin, as if it needed a view. "Round 2, Elijah said, accepting a bagel like it was a trophy. "Do we sand the edge or adjust the strike plate?" "Neither," Ethan said. "We listen. Then we decide." They knelt. The door whispered its complaint. Together, they found the place where wood had swelled just enough to ask for gentleness. They obliged. "You're good at this," Elijah said solemnly. "I'm learning," Ethan answered. Naomi watched the edge of the scene as if it might overbalance. It didn't. It held. After they were done, she walked him to the stoop. Morning in Chicago was all business. Buses asserting schedules. pigeons debating ethics, a woman across the street shaking a rug like a flag. "I went to them," he said. "It's finished." He didn't offer details like trophies. He handed them over as evidence. She studied his face. Perhaps she recognized the quiet that follows a door closed well. "Thank you," she said, "for the hinge, for the rest." "Elijah can choose the rest when he's ready," he said. "I'll be what he names me, and I'll stay." She nodded toward the city that had made and undone them. "Then stay long enough to learn our weather." "I brought a coat," he said, smiling, and she almost smiled back. When he left, he did it the way he had promised, with patience, without drama. On the corner, he looked up. In the third-floor window, a boy's hand lifted in a wave that was both hello and audit. Ethan lifted his own. For the first time in years, the gesture didn't feel like a wish. It felt like a beginning, measured correctly against the load it would need to bear. Staying, it turned out, was a set of small devotions practiced until they became a way of being. It was not a vow spoken once, but a choreography of quiet choices, showing up with time to spare, leaving when the evening asked for walls, returning on a Tuesday with citrus and patience because the air in January forgot how to be kind. Ethan learned Naomi and Elijah the way you learn a city, by walking it in all weather, by knowing which corners collect wind and which doorways smell like bread. He learned the 7:38 bus sigh outside their window like a tired uncle. He learned that Elijah worked best if the table was cleared to an exact rectangle of possibility, and that Naomi could drink coffee gone cold if a patient needed listening that took the heat from her cup. They made a schedule that felt less like a treaty and more like a hymn. Wednesday afternoons, science club, where Ethan taught torque with a shoelace and a doorknob, and Naomi corrected his metaphors when they wandered into pretension. Friday nights, meal kits assembled at the clinic for families whose weekends got long early. Sundays, the slow, deliberate sacrament of laundry. Socks paired like faithful friends, and the blue ribbon clipped to the curtain to watch over everything. Some days were unremarkable in the best way. He would arrive after school to find Elijah mid-construction, explaining, without looking up, why a triangle rescues a square from collapse. Ethan would kneel, offer a washer or a word, learn when to let a child's idea carry its own awkward wings. Naomi would come home from the clinic with tired eyes and a mouth softened by a newborn's first cry still echoing in it. The three of them would orbit the kitchen, the conversation a current that carried and returned, until the evening settled into sums and dishes, and the kind of quiet that means you are safe. Other days demanded proof. A late snow blew in hard from the lake, stripping the streets to their bone. The lights flickered once, twice, and surrendered. In the sudden dark, Elijah drew in his breath and reached for a hand, Naomi's out of habit, then Ethan's because it was there. Ethan moved without speech, found the flashlights in the drawer by listening to Naomi describe, in the unflustered cadence she used at work, where everything lived. He layered blankets, wrapped the kettle in a towel to trick it into holding its heat, coaxed an old battery radio into a thread of news. Naomi lit the candles she saved for birthdays. Their flames turned the room into a chapel the color of honey. When the wind pushed a thin whine through the window casings, Elijah climbed into Ethan's lap with the solemnity of a cat claiming a sun patch. "If we all exhale at the same time," he announced, "do you think the apartment will feel warmer?" "We can try," Ethan said, and together they breathed, a ridiculous holy moment that lifted the chill by a degree of laughter. After the power returned, long past bedtime, Naomi found Ethan in the hallway adjusting the weather strip with gentle, exacting hands. She watched him, unseen, and realized that love, when relearned, can look like a man on his knees before a draft, refusing to let cold make a decision for the people he loves. Trust wasn't an escalator. It was stairs, taken one at a time, with breath for the climb. They had moments where their feet slipped. One afternoon, a courier brought the lab envelope with its official calm. Naomi set it on the mantel and went to stir a pot, as though heat could keep it from burning its truth into the room. Later, when Elijah was at Mr. Singh's learning to count in Punjabi for fun, she slid it open and read the words that named what their bones already knew. Ethan didn't reach for it. He watched her face and let the answer arrive where it needed to. She folded the document once, twice, tucked it into the folder with the scholarship letter and the 3 photographs, and said very quietly, "This doesn't change the speed." "No," he said, "only the map." Elijah asked that night why some papers were heavy. Naomi told him, "Because they carry names." He nodded with a gravity beyond his years, then fell asleep with the plane he had named Mercy under his hand. Ethan taught himself other forms of staying. He enrolled in a weekend first aid course, returned with a certification card and a bag of superhero bandages that Naomi insisted were a waste until she watched a 6-year-old at the clinic stop crying at the sight of Wonder Woman on her knee. He learned to cook the rice the way Naomi liked it, each grain separate and shining, not because she asked, but because honoring a preference is how you keep a history from fraying. He learned to excuse himself when conversations edged toward the old house on Astor, not to protect his parents, but to protect the room. He learned to apologize before he was asked. On Thursdays, he and Elijah met at the library. They read everything: flight manuals, fairy tales, a book on bridges that made them both reverent. Elijah would lean into him, humming when the sentence unfolded exactly right. Sometimes Naomi joined after shift change, sitting across from them with her shoes off and her face bare of the day, reading a novel with a spine creased by longing. When their eyes met over the table's sea of pages, something thrummed between them. Not a thunderclap this time, but a steady current, a river learning its banks again. There were arguments, brief but honest. Naomi called him out when his generosity tilted toward grandeur. He bristled, then breathed, then brought soup in silence. He told her when exhaustion made her cruel. She listened, then slept, then woke softer. They tried not to use history like a weapon. Most nights they succeeded. One evening, Elijah set 3 spoons on the table and announced, in the tone of a scientist preparing the room for revelation, "There are 3 kinds of time: fast when you're late, slow when you're bored, and the kind that feels like a good song." "What's the third called?" Ethan asked. "Staying," Elijah said simply. After dishes, Naomi stood at the sink and let the warm water climb her wrists. Ethan dried. Outside, a siren threaded the block and thinned away. "Do you ever miss who we were?" she asked, not as a trap, but as an inquiry conducted in dim light. "Every day," he said, "but I'd rather love who we are learning to be." She turned the faucet off and listened to the apartment remember its own quiet. She reached for a plate. He reached too. Their fingers brushed in a domestic accident that wasn't, for once, a metaphor. Neither of them snatched their hand away. On the couch, Elijah slept sideways, the ribbon on the curtain keeping its modest watch. The plane on the bookshelf caught a slant of street lamp and shone. The hinge they had fixed 2 days before closed without argument in the bathroom. A small, faithful sound. Staying didn't feel like a sentence anymore. It felt like a craft, like joinery, like music practiced until your hands knew the shape without asking your head. It felt like a man taking off his coat and leaving it on the same chair because he planned to put it on from that spot tomorrow. It felt like a woman opening the window 2 inches every morning to let the city in, because she trusted she could keep what mattered from blowing away. It felt, at last, like a life that had stopped running from its weather and started learning how to be a home inside of it. It began with a cough that didn't know when to stop. Small at first, the throat-clearing sound a child makes when a joke lands wrong. February had pressed its cold face to the window all day, and the apartment had answered with radiators that sang and tea that refused to stay hot. Elijah worked at the table under the modest guard of his blue ribbon, pencil moving like a patient metronome. Naomi checked the time between charting notes on her phone and stirring a pot that wanted to be soup. "Water?" she asked. "I'm okay," Elijah said, but the okay broke into 2 coughing fits that folded him forward. Naomi was beside him before the pencil settled. She laid the back of her hand to his forehead. No fever, only the dry heat of a room doing its best, then counted under her breath. 1, 2, 3. She had learned to time everything. Breaths, drips, tears that paused to listen. The sound changed, deeper now, stubborn, with a wheeze hiding in it. Naomi reached for the inhaler, the spacer already snapped together. 3 slow breaths, she said calm. Elijah obeyed. He always did when the room asked with this voice. Ethan came in on a gust of hall cold, cheeks stung red, a paper bag crinkling, citrus and scallions, the promise of a stir-fry that could comfort a tired spine. The door closed soft, the way he'd learned. He saw their posture, Naomi's stillness, Elijah's shoulders, and his own body quieted around theirs. "Hey," he said lightly, as if a greeting could steady a table. "Bad air day?" Elijah nodded between pulls on the spacer. Naomi didn't look away from the boy's chest. "He started earlier," she said. "We'll see if this round turns the corner." They waited. Sometimes that's all medicine is, clever waiting with a plan behind it. The cough stepped back, but the breath did not relax its fist. A high, thin whistle threaded the room. Naomi's gaze flicked to the window. The cold had thickened. The city had sharpened. The weather had learned to reach through walls. She gave another dose, listened, and felt the small percussion under her palm. "Again," she said softly. Ethan set the bag on the counter and opened the drawer where they kept the oximeter. He didn't ask. He had learned the choreography. Naomi slid the clip over Elijah's finger. Red numbers bloom, heart quick, oxygen lower than the family's comfort. She closed her eyes for one breath and opened them as if she were the hinge that must not stick. "We're going," she said. The next minutes were practiced grace. Elijah into socks in his thickest sweater, the emergency bag with insurance cards and a book, the inhaler and spacer, Naomi's phone, charged. Ethan moved like water around a stone, coats, keys, elevator button punched and held. In the lobby, Mr. Singh looked up from his crossword, saw the shape of the scene, and held the door the way a person holds a prayer. The air in the street bit. A taxi slid to the curb, the driver reading the wheeze and waving away the address. "Children's? Get in." Naomi climbed in with Elijah tucked against her side. Ethan took the front, his hands flat on his knees because there was nothing to fix except the distance between here and there. They arrived in a slash of light and linoleum. The emergency department knew the weather's signature. The waiting room held a chorus of winter, barking coughs, flushed cheeks, mothers with coats draped over sleeping heads. Naomi crossed the threshold and became, for a moment, the nurse she was. Crisp, clear, delivering Elijah's story in a stream that helped the triage nurse help her. The pulse ox confirmed what her palm had already known. A wristband looped, automatic doors parted, and they were inside the bright hum where fear learns to stand in a corner and wait its turn. The treatment room was a narrow rectangle, its fluorescent hum less cruel than it meant to be. A respiratory therapist named Raina rolled in the nebulizer with the competence of somebody who'd done this in her dreams. "Hey, champ," she said to Elijah. "We're going to make some steam dragons together." Elijah nodded, wide-eyed but steady. He was brave in the way children are when two steady adults make a bridge with their bodies and invite him to cross. Naomi positioned the mask. Ethan held the tubing like a lifeline. The machine began its crescendo, a thin rush that smelled faintly of plastic and mint. "Slow," Naomi murmured to her son. "Let the medicine tell your lungs a story." He breathed. He coughed. He breathed again. The numbers flirted with the line they needed to cross. Raina adjusted the dose without commentary, the kind of magic that refuses to announce itself. A physician stepped in, hands washed clean and gentle. "I'm Dr. Patel," she said. "We're going to watch him for a bit, take a chest film to be sure we're not missing a party we don't want." Her eyes found Naomi's with recognition, the fraternity of people who have both given and received the same speech. "You doing okay, Mom?" "I'm breathing for both of us," Naomi said and almost smiled. Ethan stood to the side where his presence made the room larger. He pressed his palm flat against the cool metal of the sink for one heartbeat. Ground, calibrate. Then returned to the foot of the bed when Elijah's hand searched for him. The boy's fingers wrapped around his. The grip said more than any name could. Time slipped into hospital time, the odd elastic of minutes measured by drips and monitor beeps. The X-ray tech wheeled in a portable unit. The shadow play of bones appeared on a screen that didn't care about love, only about light. "No consolidation," Dr. Patel said. "Good. We're in bronchospasm territory. We'll escalate treatment and see if we can coax those airways open." They worked. Naomi counted. Ethan fetched water, warmed blankets, permission from the night. When the second nebulizer finished its song, the wheeze lowered by a note. After the third, Elijah's shoulders loosened. Numbers crept up, modest and miraculous. Better, Raina said softly, as if afraid to spook the improvement. Elijah's eyelids had the heavy shimmer of surrender. "Mom?" he asked, voice a rasp of paper. "I'm here," Naomi said. "Ethan?" he whispered, as if the night might need him named to be trusted. "I'm here," Ethan answered, and Naomi did not correct the name. Not tonight. They dimmed the lights. Dr. Patel outlined the plan. Home if the climb held, with steroids and instructions. Back if the weather in his chest changed its mind. Naomi nodded like a lieutenant receiving orders she could carry out in her sleep. When the door closed, the room exhaled. Fear, when it is finally allowed to sit down, sometimes cries. Naomi let 2 quiet tears go and then pressed her knuckles to her mouth as if she were saving sugar for later. Ethan saw and did not move toward her until she lifted a hand. He sat, not touching, only near. "I hate the sound," she said, "that small harmonica in his ribs." "I know," he said. "I hate that I'm learning this music now, not when the first verse started." She looked at him, eyes bright in the machine glow. "And yet, here you are." He nodded. "Here I am." They watched Elijah sleep the way people watch a tide, alert for rip and turn. The boy's breath, once a stubborn door, swung easier now. His hand relaxed but did not release Ethan's fingers. Naomi's shoulders went down 1 notch. In the hush, the monitors became almost tender. "Do you remember the first time we slept in a hospital?" Ethan asked after a while, voice soft enough not to wake the machines. "Not as patients. As students sneaking coffee between rotations. You drew circuit diagrams on your wrist because you'd run out of paper," Naomi said, a laugh catching at the edge of the memory. "You said if we could quantify compassion, we'd never run out." "I was arrogant." "You were hopeful," she said. "They're cousins you have to introduce properly." He breathed out a smile. "I'm learning the etiquette." She reached across the space and found his sleeve. Not his hand, his sleeve. It was distance and contact in one gesture, a treaty signed in dim light. "You did well," she said. "You didn't fix. You stayed." "I am learning how to be furniture," he said. "Sturdy. Unremarkable. Useful. You may graduate to lamp," she replied. "We'll see." Near dawn, the window paled from black to graphite. Dr. Patel returned with a discharge plan gentle as a landing. Elijah woke, blinked at the ceiling, and declared himself hungry in a voice that made them laugh because it sounded like morning. Papers signed, prescriptions in hand, winter coats buttoned, the small ceremonies of leaving. Outside, the air had softened by a degree that only Chicagoans and people who have known fear can measure. They stepped into it together, the 3 of them tucked into each other's weather. The taxi driver from the night shift was still there, sipping tea from a thermos. He gestured as if he'd been waiting his whole life to drive this one boy safely home. In the apartment, the radiators hummed their old hymn. Naomi set the kettle, because that is what a person does when the night has tried to convince her the world cannot be warmed. Ethan lifted Elijah's shoes into the line by the door, their rubber soles touching like friends who had kept a secret. Elijah sank onto the couch with the blanket he claimed as his own, the one Mrs. Ellis had knit in colors that refused to apologize for themselves. He looked up at them with a gravity that made Naomi feel both ancient and newborn. "Were you scared?" he asked. "Yes," Naomi said. "Yes," Ethan said. "It's okay," Elijah nodded, as if pasting a star to a chart. "I was too. But we breathed." Naomi touched his cheek. "We breathed." The city shook out its shoulders. A bus sighed. A neighbor laughed at something the rest of the block wouldn't hear until later. Naomi looked at Ethan, and he looked back, both of them holding the kind of tired that feels like a vow kept under pressure. The night had come to measure them. It had found them exactly the size they claimed. No larger, no smaller, sturdy enough to carry one sleeping boy, and the fragile, fearless rumor of a family that was learning its own strong music. Morning wore the look of something spared. It came through the blinds not as triumph but as permission. Thin bands of light laying themselves across the couch where Elijah dozed, the nebulizer mask abandoned like a spent seashell on the table. Naomi moved softly in a sweater that remembered other long nights. Ethan cracked eggs with reverence that approached prayer. The apartment smelled like toast and reprieve. Elijah woke with the luxurious stretch of boys who believe the day will meet them halfway. "Hungry," he announced, voice almost his own again. "Good," Naomi said, setting a plate before him. "That's the body's way of ringing the all clear." Ethan poured tea, ginger and honey, the patient kind. He watched mother and son the way a person watches a shoreline after a storm, counting the boats that made it back, taking stock of what the sea had kept. When Elijah finished, he accepted the small, solemn task of placing his inhaler on the ledge beside the blue ribbon. "Two heroes," he said, and Naomi smiled because children invent parades the world forgets to throw. That afternoon, the city resumed its errands. Naomi walked to the clinic with the buoyant steadiness of someone who had been asked a question and answered it. Ethan took the day from his calendar and offered it instead to maintenance, replacing batteries and smoke detectors, refolding the hall closet into a sermon on order, sanding the whisper from the bathroom door until it closed with the kind of certainty he wanted to practice in other rooms. Elijah, still under house rules of quiet adventures, turned the living room into a laboratory where paper planes tested the ethics of air. When Naomi returned, dusk poised on the window ledge like a cat deciding whether to come in. She stood a moment in the doorway, watching the domestic argument between light and lamplight, and feeling, without bravado, that she had made a home in the contested space. Ethan straightened from the closet with a grin more sheepish than victorious. "Everything has a label," he said. "I got evangelical about batteries." "Careful," she replied, hanging her scarf. "I hear zeal converts badly." "Then call it devotion," he said. They ate simply, rice that respected itself, lentils with a squeeze of lemon, the kind of food that trusts history more than garnish. Elijah demonstrated a new wing design and announced a hypothesis about lift that Naomi wrote down as if it were a prescription. Later, when he slept, they sat at the table with papers that altered their lives without fanfare. The paternity filing was as plain as government could make it. Lines for names, boxes for dates, a signature that meant a boy's story would henceforth include a word he could claim without apology. Naomi read every line, lips moving as if the syllables mattered, and they did. Ethan waited without fidgeting. When she handed him the pen, he signed with a care that had nothing to do with ink. "This is not a door kicked in," he said. "It's a key borrowed and returned." She nodded. "And a lock changed later, when we've agreed where it should be." They laughed softly, because humor is how brave people steady their hands. She slid the papers into a folder with the scholarship letter and the 3 photographs. There was room now for other documents, a future that could be filed under its real name. On Friday, they went to the clerk's office, where bureaucracy wore fluorescent light and good intentions. The clerk, a woman with nails like polished sunrise, examined their forms and looked up with the small smile of someone who enjoys witnessing subtle history. "Congratulations," she said, stamping what needed stamping. The sound landed in Naomi's chest like percussion. Ethan exhaled, a fraction nearer to something he would not call peace, because the word felt gaudy, but which did not feel unlike it. They walked out into the kind of winter afternoon Chicago keeps for citizens who have earned it. Blue-gold sky, air that bid only to remind you of your edges. Elijah, released early from school, ran ahead, his scarf a comet tail. "Family hot chocolate," he decreed, and since he had named it, it became law. In the cafe, they took the table by the radiator because warmth is a habit you choose before it chooses you. Elijah dunked a marshmallow with clinical concentration, then looked at them as if preparing to publish a finding. "If I had 3 lives," he said, "I would want them all to be this one." Naomi felt the statement like a weight she would carry gladly. Ethan blinked hard, then smiled at her over the boy's head, with the expression of a man who had been granted a re-sitting of an exam he once failed and intended, this time, to pass by honest study rather than charm. Second chances were not a new country. They were the old street walked with better shoes. They learned that week how to apologize without defending the past. Naomi practiced letting the future speak before history interrupted. Ethan practiced not mistaking provision for penance. Elijah practiced breathing, medicine on the mantle, confidence in his pocket, a mother and a man counting with him when the air forgot its manners. The clinic grew a little easier under the Grant's quiet weather. The new ultrasounds sang in pixels instead of static. A volunteer architect from Ethan's world sketched a waiting room that would fit strollers without inventing collisions. Naomi found herself with an extra 15 minutes between patients one day and sat in that margin like a person discovering a chair in a long hallway. She wrote Elijah a note that he would find in his lunch. Mercy flies today. Love, Mom. At the warehouse in Pilsen, Ethan wrote code that made his small company useful to people who couldn't translate their questions into charts. He hired a teenager Naomi recommended, a girl who had taught herself Python on a borrowed phone, and watched with admiration as she optimized a routine he had written too proudly. He found that competence without dominance felt like relief. On a Saturday that pretended to be spring, they took the bus to the lake and walked the shoreline between snowmelt and stubborn ice. Gulls voiced their operatic grievances. Elijah launched Mercy into a wind that approved of engineering and watched it arc back as if tethered by intention. Naomi tucked her gloved hand into Ethan's elbow without deliberation, the way people do when the body knows a path and the mind is done arguing. He did not remark on it. He altered his stride to match hers. "Why did you keep the pictures?" he asked after a long drift of quiet that was not empty. "Because I wanted to remember I hadn't imagined it," she said, "and because keeping what hurt me became proof that it would not own me." He nodded, grateful for a language that did not require him to be the hero of every sentence. "I kept the letters in my wallet for months," he said, "not as a penance, as a compass." "And now?" she asked. "Now I look up more than down." They turned back when Elijah's cheeks went apple-bright from wind. On the bus, the boy rested his head against the window and counted delivery trucks like sheep. Naomi leaned into the gentle sway and closed her eyes for 3 stops. Ethan watched the city unspool in reverse and felt, with a quiet astonishment, that he belonged to it again. Not through buildings that carried his name, but through a child who carried his laugh, and a woman who had taught him the difference between leaving and letting go. That night, after dishes and checklists and the ritual inspection of inhalers, Elijah fell asleep angled across his pillow, one hand still in the air, as if he had been waving to a future that finally waved back. Naomi stood in the doorway with the small, stunned gratitude of survivors. Ethan joined her, kept the distance they had agreed on, and let the sight settle him. "Look," she whispered, "he trusts the air again." "So do I," he said and meant it. In the living room, the blue ribbon caught a draft and quivered like something newly feathered. Mercy gleamed on the bookshelf. The repaired hinges held their counsel. Outside, February loosened its grip by a degree, and somewhere near the river a sheet of ice cracked with the exact music of a door opening from the inside. Second chances, they were discovering, did not arrive all at once with trumpets. They crept in with groceries, waited in clinic corridors, signed their names with ordinary pens, and took off their coats on the same chair each evening. They were at last, not the miracle that erased the past, but the discipline that believed tomorrow deserved something truer than what yesterday knew how to give. March arrived like a door that hadn't decided whether to open or slam. The city's light had thinned to a pale gold that forgave little and revealed much. Naomi walked to the clinic with Elijah's scarf still warm in her hands, his breath a sweet ghost at the wool. Mercy sat on the bookshelf at home like a small vow. Ethan had left early for Pilsen, a thermos of coffee and a plan tucked into his jacket. It felt, for a handful of days, like a life with its shoes tied. The shadow did not announce itself. It simply stood there when she turned the corner onto State and 24th. 2 news vans with their antennae craned like curious birds, a camera already aimed at the clinic's blue door. A reporter in winter lipstick smiled without her eyes. "Miss Carter? Naomi Carter?" The microphone leaned toward Naomi as if it were a flower seeking sun. "Care to comment on allegations that the Moore Foundation's grant constitutes self-dealing?" Naomi stopped so that her face would not be a blur someone could misinterpret later. "Our patients are my comment," she said evenly. "We open in 10 minutes. "Is it true," the reporter sang, "that the foundation is run by the father of your child?" Naomi did not blink. "It's true we work very hard," she replied. "Please don't film the children." Inside, Anna locked the door behind her with shaking hands. "They were here at 7, she whispered. "Greer is on the phone with the bank." As if conjured, Dr. Greer appeared with a face that had practiced calm and now needed to use it. "Temporary hold," she said, a scrap of paper trembling between her fingers. The foundation's disbursement is frozen pending a compliance review. We have 2 payrolls covered and then air. Who initiated it? Naomi asked. Anonymous counsel, Greer said. Someone who knows how to sound official. The word anonymous put its cold finger at the base of Naomi's neck. She thought of a house on Astor Street that curated the air, of pearl earrings that held their own light. She did not say the names sitting on her tongue. Names have a way of believing they belong once you speak them. They opened anyway, because people come. A mother whose morning sickness had made her world a small, lurching boat. A teenager with a cut that needed cleaning and a story that needed listening. A father who had learned to measure insulin without fear. Work, pressed forward, like water finding its slope. Near noon, the second shadow fell. A woman in a navy coat with a badge that asked the room to behave stood at the desk. "Good afternoon. I'm from DCFS," she said gently, as if apologizing for her own presence. "We received a report about a minor with respiratory distress last week. We'd like to conduct a wellness check." The report. Anonymous, of course. The night of fear had left a rumor in the world. There are people who feed on such rumors. Naomi's spine found its length. "You're welcome here," she said. "We were at Children's Thursday. I'm a nurse. The charting is immaculate." She didn't add, "I counted breaths. I held the line. I am not your story." "Procedure," the woman said with real sympathy. "We'll need to see the home, speak with guardians, confirm the safety plan." She paused. "I'm a mother too." Naomi texted Ethan one word, "now," and included an address as if he could be lost. He wasn't. 15 minutes later, he was at the clinic doorway, breath visible, tie slightly crooked like an earnest apology. He shook the caseworker's hand and introduced himself using only his name. No titles. Titles do not change air. They rode the elevator up with the caseworker standing between them, holding a tablet like a shield. In the apartment, Elijah looked up from a book on bridges, unconcerned, the trust of boys who are loved making a bright room brighter. "This is Miss Howell," Naomi said. "She's here to check our hinges." Humor in hard light, Naomi's quiet spell work. Miss Howell smiled. Exactly that. She walked through the rooms, noting outlets with covers, a smoke detector with a fresh blink, the inhaler on the mantel like a talisman positioned exactly at hand. She asked Elijah to show her where he keeps his medicine. He gave her a tour with the dignity of a museum docent. Ethan answered questions without offering speeches. Naomi pulled the discharge papers from the ER, the steroid taper, the follow-up note in Dr. Patel's compact hand. The apartment gave the right answers: warmth, order, a table with 3 chairs and a fourth that sometimes hosted laundry. Back at the door, Ms. Howell slipped her card into Naomi's palm. "You're fine," she said quietly, "but it's going to be noisy for a little while. Be steady." "We have practice," Naomi said. When they returned to the clinic, the noise had found new throats. An article had gone live with a headline that did not blink. "More money, private ties. Questions surround quiet clinic grant." The photo was of Naomi's back, taken from across the street, a composition that turned privacy into intrigue. Anna stood at the copier feeding forms to families who might be nervous about cameras. Greer had her jaw set to determined. Ethan's phone vibrated as if it were a frightened animal trying to get free. He glanced and saw the number he expected but had hoped not to. Vivian. He did not answer. Another call. Walter. He let it ring into the silence it deserved. A text arrived from a board ally at the foundation. "Family Council has lodged a conflict complaint. We need your formal recusal on any clinic decisions pending review. I'm with you. We'll build a firewall. Stay visible and polite." He showed Naomi the message. "This is what they have," he said. "Process. We'll answer it with better process." "That and patience," she added. He nodded. "And light." Light came in unexpected ways. The volunteer architect posted sketches of the clinic's new layout with a caption that made dignity look like a blueprint. Dr. Greer wrote a statement that read like a human, not a brand. "We serve. We will continue to serve. We welcome oversight. We require compassion." Patients stopped at the desk to sign their names under a sentence Anna had taped to a clipboard. "This place kept me breathing when I forgot how." The line grew until the paper looked feathered with gratitude. Near closing, a bouquet arrived. White lilies, elegant as a verdict. No card, because some messages wear their sender like a perfume. Naomi did not bring them upstairs. She carried them to the alley and left them beside the recycling, where beauty proves its value by not demanding an audience. When she came back in, Ethan's face held questions he did not force into words. "I know," she said. "I will not stage a war in front of my people, but I will not decorate for one either." He felt something old in him salute. Evening found them at the kitchen table, their fortress of ordinary. Elijah sorted screws by length for a project that might never need them. He called it stocking the future. Naomi wrote her shifts into the calendar with the practical tenderness of someone scheduling weather. Ethan drafted a letter on his laptop that would live on the foundation's site by morning. A statement of recusal, of governance, of how love can be named without being used. When he finished, Naomi read it and set her finger on a line. "Leave this," she said. "No donation should bind a hand that needs to lift freely." He looked up. She held his gaze and something mutual and fierce moved between them. Not romance's bright flame, but the coal you build a life around. The door buzzer startled the apartment into alert. Naomi glanced at the clock. Too late for neighbors, too early for delivery. Ethan approached the intercom and pressed the small button like a hinge. "Yes?" The speaker crackled. A voice he knew filled the stairwell with silk. "Ethan, it's your mother." He closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, Naomi was already shaking her head. "Not like this," she whispered. "Not at our door." He pressed the button again. "Not tonight," he said, voice even. "Send a letter." Silence. Then the soft, disbelieving laugh of a woman unaccustomed to closed doors. "You have made a spectacle of this family," Vivian said, her lower register sweet as a blade. "Do you even know what you've invited into your life?" Ethan looked at the table where Elijah sorted small, necessary things into order. "Yes," he said. "I know exactly." "Be careful," she replied, which in that house meant beware of love. The buzzer stilled. The building exhaled. Ethan returned to the table like a man who had passed a test without showing his work. Elijah looked up. "Do we know her?" he asked, not with fear, but with the curiosity he applied to clouds. "We do," Naomi said, "but we're learning how to know people at a distance that keeps everyone safe." "That's a kind of bridge," Elijah mused, returning to the screws. It did not end that night. Shadows do not retreat because you stare them down once. The article spawned a second. A radio show debated the ethics of anonymous grants with the same zeal it gave to sports. The Foundation's audit team arrived with clipboards and care. DCFS closed their file politely. The clinic kept its lights on. Dr. Greer sent Naomi home at 10 with a look that said, "Go be where you belong." Ethan added a second set of weather stripping to the windows because protection has many dialects. In the dark, they lay on their separate sides of the apartment's small geography and listened to the radiators rehearse spring. Fear had indeed struck back. It had been measured and found of human size. Naomi thought of the lilies in the alley, their fragrance rising to no one. Ethan thought of the firewall being built in the foundation, the kind of structure that proves itself by refusing to be interesting. Elijah dreamed of bridges, some the length of the kitchen table, one that arched from the apartment window to a future that looked like morning. And morning came, stubborn and unshowy, as it always does when called by people who have learned the slow, exacting art of staying. They called it a compliance review, which is how institutions say trial without admitting to theater. The room the state rented for the day resembled a modest concert hall. Wooden panels that turned voices into instruments, rows of chairs that asked spines to be brave. Outside, April pressed its forehead to the windows like a polite guest. Rain held back, light undecided. Naomi wore the dress she trusted for difficult rooms. Charcoal, clean lines, pockets for her hands when they wanted to betray her. Ethan arrived carrying a folder that held more surrender than defense. Recusal letters, board minutes, the dull heroism of timestamps. Dr. Greer unfolded herself in the aisle like a flag refusing wind. Anna had clipped her hair up with a pen and brought a tote bag full of patient testimonials written in the careful hand of people who rarely write for strangers. Elijah sat between Naomi and Ethan, a notebook in his lap. He had promised to sketch bridges if boredom insisted. At the front, a dais. Behind it, a panel of three. An assistant attorney general who introduced herself as Miss Lynn, an accountant whose glasses had the gravity of winter, and a former nonprofit director who had learned how to smile without wasting words. To their right sat a court reporter, fingers poised like a pianist. "Thank you for appearing," Ms. Lynn began, the ritual courtesy that girds an arena. "We are here to determine whether the Moore Foundation's grant to South Loop Community Clinic constituted prohibited self-dealing and whether remedial measures are necessary." She looked at Ethan, then at Naomi. "We are also here to understand how private lives and public good met at this door." Statements first. The Foundation's counsel stood and did what counsel do, made chronology behave, turned governance into a quilt whose seams could be traced. Ethan's recusal, notarized. The grant's path through a blind review, documented. The firewall, built after the article as if the building had known all along it would need it. No money to Naomi, only supplies to a clinic that billed via a sliding scale and compassion. Opposite, a lawyer whose shoes understood marble presented the complaint. Appearances matter. The world swivels on optics. Charity must not become a doorway for desire. He said conflict the way some people say crime, and let the words sit in the room until heads tilted. "Appearances matter," Ethan said when invited to reply. He didn't raise his voice, he lowered the temperature. "Which is why I left decisions to a committee before I knew which clinic would pass their test. Which is why I stand behind their choice now. Which is why I've promised to remain recused." He paused, a breath the room needed. "The work preceded my knowing. It will continue if I leave," he gestured, not at Naomi, not at himself, but at the stack of mundane papers that keep good houses from burning. "We are here to protect a process that protects people." The panel asked questions. They asked more. They asked them again, each time slightly reframed, like measuring a doorway from several angles to be sure the piano will pass. The accountant inquired about subpoenaed emails. The nonprofit director wanted to know who sat in the committee room and whether the window opened. Miss Lynn, efficient and unexpectedly gentle, made sure the record recorded not just compliance, but clarity. When it was Naomi's turn, she stood with the stillness she uses to stop a bleeding that wants to learn momentum. "I have served this clinic for 7 years," she said. "I knew Ethan at university. Then I did not. When the grant arrived, it arrived under a name that didn't announce itself. We spent it on ultrasounds and warm chairs and time. Later, a private story returned to my door. We chose to tell it the pace that kept a child whole." "Do you profit from this grant?" Ms. Lynn asked. Naomi shook her head. "I profit from seeing a baby's heart translate itself into sound." A ripple moved through the room, something like air approving. They called witnesses. Dr. Greer spoke like a scaffold, upright, bearing weight. Anna read the sheet of signatures from the clipboard until the panel asked her, smiling, to summarize. A respiratory therapist named Raina described the night a machine sang mint into a small boy's lungs, and a mother counted breaths without breaking. A man in a paint-splattered hoodie told the panel how the clinic had given his wife a test she could trust when fear told her stories that windows twist into ghosts. From the back row, where privileges often sit, a woman stood. Pearls, navy wool, winter's poise in April. Vivian Moore. "May I be heard?" she asked, and the room, which understood drama, held its breath. Ms. Lynn tilted her head. "Briefly." Vivian stepped forward and placed a gloved hand on the lectern, as if it were a crystal she meant to polish with her presence. "Philanthropy," she said, each syllable receiving its inheritance, "depends on the faith of the public. We must not only be clean, we must look clean." Naomi could feel Ethan go very still beside her, as if a hinge that had learned to swing freely remembered rust. Vivian continued, "My son is generous. He is also naive in the ways of optics, a smile that practiced disarming. I have done what any mother does, attempt to keep him from harm. If that has been interpreted..." "Mrs. Moore," Miss Lynn said evenly, "did you or your counsel file the initial complaint?" Silence has many dialects. This one said yes without vocabulary. Vivian lifted her chin a millimeter, the old house on Astor firming in her spine. "It is the duty of citizens to protect institutions," she replied at last. "Even from themselves." "Thank you," Ms. Lynn said, which is how the state says, "That will be all." When Vivian had returned to her row, Elijah tugged Ethan's sleeve. He whispered into the fold of his jacket the way a child tells the ocean a secret. "If a bridge is too heavy," he said, "you don't burn it. You build another one beside it and walk over." Ethan closed his eyes for one heartbeat and reopened them with the architecture of that wisdom in place. The panel recessed. Naomi's hands found her pockets. Ethan's found the edge of their row and held it the way sailors hold rails. The room buzzed the way beehives do when a decision moves up from worker to queen. Outside the windows, rain started at last, courteous and thorough. When Ms. Lynn returned, she did not perform. "The law asks two questions," she said. "Was there a prohibited transaction? And did governance respond appropriately when risk appeared?" She slid a paper slightly, as if aligning a plane to runway lights. "We find no prohibited transaction. We find an appearance of conflict that has been addressed with sufficient corrective measures. Recusal, firewall, independent oversight on future grants. We recommend a memorandum of understanding between the foundation and the clinic to formalize what is now practice." She looked up. "We also note, for the record, that reports made in bad faith endanger the very trust they claim to defend." It was not a parade. It was better. It was the sound of something sturdy being named aloud. There were handshakes that meant more than etiquette. Counsel collected their briefcases like well-trained dogs. Vivian rose and left without turning. Walter, who had sat silent as a portrait, followed, his cufflinks small moons in artificial light. The news vans idled, then departed in search of sexier storms. People filtered toward Naomi the way people do when they are grateful to see someone still standing. Dr. Greer pressed foreheads to foreheads the way grandmothers bless. Anna cried exactly 2 tears and declared she had to get back before the 3:30 prenatal group began without muffins. Ethan didn't speak. He reached for Naomi's hand with an unbelting slowness, an offering that asked permission as it arrived. Her fingers threaded through his, not because triumph required clasping, but because truth had tested their tensile strength and found, today, no fracture. They walked out into the rain, a fine, workmanlike precipitation that reminded the city it could be clean. Elijah tilted his face up and opened his mouth, catching the sky like a kid who believed sweetness could fall from anywhere. He lifted his notebook. On its page, a bridge stretched from a box labeled law to a small house with a blue door and a waiting room full of chairs. Underneath, in block letters a 4th grader could trust, he had written, "Strong enough for everyone." "Time to get back," Naomi said. "They'll be asking for you." "Who?" Ethan asked. "The cabinet hinges," she replied, smiling. And the word home meant what it used to mean when the world was new. A place you return to steady, to fix, to love, to keep from storm. Summer returned like a long, deep breath. The lake no longer wore its armor of ice, and the wind off its surface came warm, tasting faintly of iron and forgiveness. Naomi stood on the roof of their building, her hair gathered by the same restless breeze that lifted the city's flags. Below, the streets hummed, the sound of a city not mending but continuing. Above, the sky stretched in every direction, wide enough to contain what they had been and what they were learning to become. Ethan joined her, careful of the ledge. He carried a paper plane in one hand, the same design Elijah had refined a dozen times until the air itself had learned to admire it. "He's downstairs," Ethan said, "building a launch platform out of cereal boxes. Says it's time for the next test flight." Naomi smiled. "That sounds about right." They stood together, not touching, not needing to. The last few months had folded and unfolded like paper, each crease visible, none regretted. The foundation's name had survived the audit, the clinic's doors never closed. Vivian's complaint had dissolved into silence, her pride finding a quieter form of love expressed through distance. Elijah had grown taller, more deliberate in his speech. He'd started signing his drawings with Elijah Carter Moore, a hyphen that carried its own kind of peace. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't found those letters?" Naomi asked softly. Ethan turned the plane in his fingers. "Sometimes. But I think the universe is patient with slow learners. It gives you the same test until you answer truthfully. She nodded, her gaze following the skyline. Truth has been patient with us. Below, laughter rose from the courtyard. Elijah's, high and clear. He shouted something about Mission Mercy 2 and waved up at them, a small figure haloed by sunlight. Naomi raised her hand in return. The boy's faith, unbroken, carried more strength than either of them would admit. Ethan watched her profile, the steadiness in her, the calm she'd built from years of surviving what most would flee. "I don't want to be the shadow anymore," he said. "I want to be the steady thing he builds toward." "You already are," Naomi said. "You just haven't noticed that you stopped chasing and started staying." He exhaled slowly. "I think staying is the only miracle that counts." Naomi looked at him then, really looked. The lines time had carved not as punishment but as scripture. The eyes that no longer demanded forgiveness because they'd learned to live inside it. "Maybe," she said, "but forgiveness still matters. Not as a gift to the past, but as a tool for the future." A door creaked behind them. Elijah emerged, clutching his plane, wings reinforced with tape. "Ready?" he called, the word bright as dawn. Ethan nodded. "Let's see what Mercy remembers." Elijah climbed onto the edge of the rooftop wall, Naomi's hand hovering near but not holding him. He squinted into the wind, adjusted his stance, and let the plane go. For a moment it faltered, a shiver of hesitation, and then it caught the current, rising, circling, gliding farther than any version before. Naomi tilted her head back, laughter spilling from her like light. Ethan watched the plane's graceful arc until it vanished into the sunlight, a ghost turned promise. "She'll come down somewhere," Elijah said proudly. "She always does," Naomi replied. "That's how we know where home is." They lingered until the sky shifted colors, the amber hour that makes every surface look forgiven. From this height, the city was a patchwork of second chances. The clinic's pale blue roof glinting, the warehouse window catching fire with sunset, the street corner where years ago, two lives had collided and then learned to rebuild. Naomi turned to Ethan. "What now?" He thought for a moment. "We keep building. Bridges, machines, trust, whatever the day asks for. And if it breaks again, then we stay until it doesn't." She reached out, taking his hand. No fanfare, no ceremony, just the quiet joining of two people who had learned that endurance can be its own kind of romance. Their fingers interlaced, familiar now, and in that ordinary contact lay everything the years had cost and returned. The first stars appeared. The air was soft with the scent of June, cut grass, gasoline, rain thinking about returning. Naomi leaned her head against his shoulder. Elijah called from below that he'd found Mercy, unscathed and waiting in the grass. "Of course she is," Ethan said, smiling. "She knows her sky." Naomi closed her eyes, the last of the day's warmth moving across her face. "Maybe that's all we were ever meant to do," she said. "Find our sky and learn how to share it." Ethan looked upward, the vastness opening above them. No longer a boundary, but a field of invitation. "The sky belongs to us," he whispered. "All three of us." "And to anyone who believes it's still possible," Naomi added. Their laughter drifted down to the street, to the boy retrieving his plane, to the clinic lights flickering on for another night of healing. Across the city, unseen, other windows glowed, lovers reconciling, strangers forgiving, tired hands holding on a little longer. The night gathered them all, as if mercy were not just a name for a paper plane, but a promise written in air. Naomi and Ethan stayed until the stars sharpened, and the world, for once, felt perfectly balanced between what had been lost and what had finally, irrevocably, been found. And somewhere in that stillness, their story, once scattered, once afraid, came home to itself, its pieces aligned like constellations that had always been waiting to be named. If this story moved you, if you believe in the quiet beauty of forgiveness, resilience, and the everyday miracle of love, share it, let it travel. Like mercy in the wind, let it find others who need to remember that even after the storm, the sky still belongs to us.